Thank you, Jennifer. It's really great to be here this morning talking about a little bit of New Jersey's hidden history. So you can think of me as we go through New Jersey as the ghost of Christmas past, if you will. So when we think about Monmouth County and New Jersey's history, we think about the county's great historic sites, places like Twin Lights, Allaire State Park, and maybe the beautiful new Visitors Center over at Monmouth Battlefield State Park. But Monmouth County's history did not begin 200 or 300 years ago. Rather, it began closer to 12,000 years ago when the first Americans arrived, crossing a land bridge, and you've probably heard this many times before, right? Crossing a land bridge from Asia and gradually spreading out across the continent. And I'm going to go through, in just a few minutes, about 12,000 years of New Jersey prehistory. It's a bit of a challenge. It's 12 minutes, 12,000 years. But this is an important, powerful story for us today because it's a story of strength and resilience in the face of an ever-changing environment. And archaeologists are changing this story of how people arrived here. It's not just a burying land bridge anymore. Now we have people coming down the coast, and they're coming into a world that is very, very different. So imagine this as Monmouth County. Huge animals, what we call Pleistocene megafauna, a fancy term for big animals, which once inhabited this area. And remains of these animals have been found not just here in the county, but also offshore. And that's because the landscape was so wildly different. It's a much colder environment. It's the end of the last glaciation. It's starting to warm up. It's tundra-like. The coastline, as you heard before, is a good 70 to 90 miles further east. At Monmouth University, we like to say we're a mile from the beach. That would not have been a selling point 10,000 years ago. They come into this completely new environment, and they're hunting and gathering to support themselves. They're making beautiful tools like the projectile points you see here. And they're using these as probably their Swiss Army knives to survive in a really challenging place. But the climate is warming up. And archaeologists call this next period, we're not very inventive when it comes to names. We call it the Archaic period, which means old. So the Archaic period begins about 10,000 years ago. It's a warmer climate. Forests are spreading north. And we start to find artifacts like the axe you see here in the photograph, because people are cutting down those forests. They're making canoes, they're building houses. Larger populations are developing. New animals, those megafauna, they've become extinct, and now they're hunting for things like white-tailed deer. We've got some sites in Monmouth County that date from this time period. Turkey Swamp, now a county park, has enormous archaeological sites from this time. The site I'm showing you here is actually in Ocean County. It's a little bit further south, and this is in Tuckerton. This is an enormous shell mound with trees growing on it out in a marsh. Now imagine how many clams and oysters you need to eat to create an island in a marsh. This is thousands of years of human habitation. And if we could go back just 100 years, we would have found similar shell mounds to this one all along the bay shore here in Monmouth County. So bigger populations, new food sources, and a warming environment. About 3,000 years ago, archaeologists talk about a new period of time. And again, we're not very inventive with the names. It's the woodland period. And it's true, they were living in woodlands. The climate is pretty much stabilized. It's going to bobble a little bit after that. And some new innovations really transformed Native American lives during this time. Horticulture, growing crops, the big three, what you might think of as the trifecta of Native American foods, corns, beans, and squash, become very important during this time. The bow and arrow is actually a new invention. It begins to show up during this time period. And we have traces of houses like this one, this longhouse, and this is a reconstruction, but archaeological traces of buildings like this have been found at sites even in Little Silver, New Jersey, not very far from here. And finally, pottery becomes common. Invented a little bit earlier, but pottery allows food to be prepared in new ways, and it allows food to be stored. So by about 500 years ago, we have 8,000 to 12,000 Native Americans living in New Jersey, or American Indians. And these are the people who are going to discover and be discovered by European explorers. Now, as an archaeologist, I use a bunch of different sources to try and understand the past. Obviously, I use artifacts. I love artifacts. I also use documents, historic documents when I can, and sometimes can work from oral traditions. So I want to change gears a little bit, and I want to tell a Native American folk tale that was recorded in 1813 by a Moravian missionary, a Christian missionary living with the Lenape in Ohio. So imagine yourselves sitting around a fire, campfire in the woods of Ohio, and you're with John Heckewelder, and he says to a group of Lenape, "What's your earliest recollection of meeting a white man?" So this is our fire, right? And here's what they say. They say, "We actually have a story about that. We remember we were on the shore, maybe by Sandy Hook, and all of a sudden, a new island appeared in the ocean." That's a disturbing thought, right? That'd be like a new moon appearing in the sky. And the island was moving. It had trees on it. It had clouds above it. There was thunder and lightning flashing from it. And we watched it. We were in awe. And then it stopped. And there were men on board of it, and they were dressed really strangely. And their talking was so odd. It sounded like dogs barking. You just couldn't understand it. And these men got into canoes, and they came towards the shore. And they got out of the canoes. And they tried to talk to Lenape, but they couldn't understand each other. And then these men took out a gourd. The gourd is probably a bottle. And they drank from the gourd. So picture Dutch sailors, explorers, maybe Henry Hudson or Cornelius May, and they're drinking from this gourd, and they pass it around, and then it comes to Lenape. They don't know what it is. So they look at it, they inspect it, they smell it, they pass it around, and it comes to the last Lenape in the group. And he addresses everyone and says, "Oh, what rude hosts we are, that these men would come from somewhere across the sea, and they would offer us a beverage, and we wouldn't drink it." And he takes an enormous gulp. And he appears then to drop down dead in front of everyone. You can imagine they're horrified. They gather around him. You know, this is a terrible tragedy. He wakes back up. Happy ending, sort of, but it's going to get bad again. He wakes back up, and they say, "You're alive," and he says, "I am," and then they all drink from it. I'm not sure I would have. They all drink from it, and not to get silly here, but you've undoubtedly heard the phrase beer goggles, right? You have a few drinks, and everything sort of changes. Well, this beverage must have been a universal communicator, because now they can speak to the Dutchmen. And the Dutchmen say to them, "We'd like to come back." And the Lenape say, "We'd like you to come back." And the Dutchmen say, "We'd like a little land." And the Lenape say, "Come again?" And they say, "We'd like a little land." And that would be rather like me asking you for some of the air in this room. You know, we all use that air. I can't really sell it. And the Lenape say, "Well, why do you need this?" And the Dutch say, "Well, we want to have a garden." So they discuss amongst themselves, you know, is this a good idea? And they say, "Well, there's a lot of land here." And finally they say yes. And they say, "But how much?" And the Dutch say, "Well, about as much as a deer's hide can cover." And then they take out a hide, and it's much bigger than your ordinary deer. Maybe it's from an ox. So Lenape are like, that's a little funny. And then, making matters worse, they cut this hide into a really thin strip. And they mark out a much bigger area than the Lenape had ever assumed. At this point, they're really like, this isn't working out. And the story ends with the Lenape saying, "And they came back year after year after year, till finally we had no land left at all." So it's a very interesting story. It compresses a lot of history there, right? It shows us the Native Americans losing their land, much of their land. It shows us the problem of alcohol that's introduced very early in the colonial period to these communities. But it's also a fairly accurate story. Now, the Native Americans who would have met the Dutch, we think of them as Lenape. They probably didn't call themselves Lenape on a day-to-day basis. Lenape actually means people. Lenni Lenape is like real or true people. You've probably heard those phrases. They thought of themselves as Navesinks, Hackensacks, Pomptons, Matitaconks. We know these names as names on the landscape today. In 150 so years after 1609, when Henry Hudson stops by Sandy Hook, New Jersey's Native Americans lost most of their lands. And this is an image showing Hudson voyaging up the Hudson River, the river that now bears his name. He called it the North River. In the 1750s, there were a series of treaties between the Lenape and the Native American, between the Lenape and the English settlers who now owned much of New Jersey. Two of them happened just west of here at Crosswicks in Burlington County at a Quaker meeting house, which you see here. One of them happened in Easton, Pennsylvania. And after these treaties were signed, the Lenape gave up almost all of their land in the state. Many moved to a reservation at a place called Chemong or Brotherton in the Pine Barrens, and others simply left and moved west to Ohio and Indiana and on finally to Wisconsin and Canada. And in some ways, this is a great tragedy of New Jersey history. But I want to end with on a sort of a different note, because not all of the Lenape left, and some even came back. And they played a really interesting role and continue to play an important role in our community today. They helped, particularly a group known as the Sand Hill Band that lived in the area around Neptune, New Jersey, and still live there. They helped build the first resort hotels in Asbury Park and Ocean Grove. They continued to meet and continue to meet today. This is a photograph of them from 1948. So their story is one of survival and persistence in the face of an ever-changing world. And I think it's really important for us, right? Many of us are residents of Monmouth County, and this past year, we went through something really horrific, but we have survived. And I think the Lenape can be an inspiration for us all as we move forward and rebuild. Thank you.